Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Wordfence Live in 2021. So you're looking at your plugins, maybe you're digging into the code a little bit and you find a security vulnerability. Maybe you're just managing a site or a handful of sites and you're seeing malicious activity that may point to an unknown vulnerability. What do you do in those cases? Well, in this episode of Wordfence Live, we're going to talk about the responsible disclosure that you would do and how security researchers report vulnerabilities to make code safer for everyone. So stay tuned. We're going to get started in just a moment. Welcome back, everyone, to Wordfence Live in this new year. Today is January 5th, 2021. Before we get started today, I just wanted to say thanks to everyone who joined us on Wordfence Live in 2020 and spent time on the stream learning with us and asking questions and sharing the content and all the feedback and kind wishes that you sent our way throughout the year. I thankfully get to talk to a lot of people in support, and it was really nice meeting a lot of you. We really appreciate it. And hopefully your 2021 is off to a great start. And we thank you again for joining us today. Let us know where you're viewing from. We always love to see where our viewers are watching from. I'm streaming live from just south of the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area today. A little chilly out, about 30 degrees. It's snowing a little bit. Not my favorite. I'm eagerly awaiting springtime here. If this is your first time joining us here, and you haven't caught any of our streams in the past, you can check out our YouTube channel here. We go over a bunch of things as far as walking through different vulnerabilities and different features that we offer and setting up Wordfence Central, so on and so forth. So if you're new here, check out the channel. There is a lot to go over there. If you are new, my name is Scott Miller. I'm a customer support engineer here at Wordfence. In a few moments, I'm going to be joined by our threat analysts, Ram Gall and Chloe Chamberlain. And today, as I mentioned, we're going to talk more about discovering vulnerabilities and more specifically, what you would do if you found one. So as I said, maybe you're looking through code, maybe you're just getting started into this thing. We talked about Security Plus and different certifications recently on the show. So if that interests you and you're interested in going down this sort of path, there's a lot to look at in recent episodes. And we're going to talk you through our process and the importance of the steps that we take on our side when we find these issues. And Chloe and Ram tend to find a lot of them. So they're going to give us a lot of information here. We're going to cover things, some basics, such as what a vulnerability is, how they're found and reported. Then we're going to discuss some types of vulnerabilities, such as 0 days. So if you're excited about today's stream, please hit the like button below here. Let us know that you're interested. We appreciate it. You can also hit the subscribe button, and if you hit the bell, you'll be notified when we go live in the future. We are typically live each Tuesday at noon Eastern Time, 9 a.m. Pacific. We've been doing this since, I want to say, March or April of 2020, so we have a good bit of content here if you want to go through and catch up on some of the stuff that you've missed. We are broadcasting to YouTube, so this information can be seen openly. So you can post some questions, but if you have anything specific to your site, we ask that you write into feedback@wordfence.com, which you can write in with any questions that might be specific to your site. Maybe your site's compromised. Rather than posting a link or anything like that, go ahead and write in and use the subject line Wordfence Live, and we will get eyes on that and give you a hand as soon as we can. So let's get started here by bringing in threat analysts Ram Gall and Chloe Chamberlain.
Hi.
Hi.
Hey Ram, hey Chloe, how's it going?
It's 2021, so hopefully it's going even better than it was.
Off to a good start. How's the, it looks chilly there, Chloe. How was the Christmas and New Year's? Did you get some snow?
Yeah, so actually Christmas was a big disappointment. We literally had like a half foot of snow on the ground, and then it decided to rain all day on Christmas, like the night before Christmas. So you woke up and there was no snow. So it's like, okay, that's kind of sad. But we got some more snow to make up for it, so I'm happy.
No, any snowboarding or skiing or not yet?
Yeah, so I went Friday night and Saturday, but I was blocked. My pass was blocked out the whole week we were off, so that was kind of sad, but all good now.
How about you, Ram? Is it cooling off a little bit there?
Oh, it's nice and chilly. There is no snow. Doesn't look like there will be snow this year. And despite what you might think, we do occasionally get some, but we just haven't.
So early here in the year 2021, I know we have a leaderboard that shows the 2020. Was it just 2020? The what you two have found, I believe, that leaderboard there? Was that just for last year?
Not 100%. I think I might have gotten up to 30, and I think Chloe might have gotten up to like 38. I'm not 100% sure that that's current.
That was going to be my next question. I have a feeling that what we're going over today, you two are working on some things now, and you're going to be doing some responsible disclosure, coming up, and that's one reason to always stay subscribed to the mailing list. We get it out really quickly there.
I think we both had a couple new ones since that leaderboard was last updated, or at least one.
We might have to clear it and start over the 2021 edition. Okay, so Ram or Chloe, do you want to give us just a little overview here of what we're going over today with responsible disclosure? Just a brief little overview of what it is, and then we can dive into all of the basics and in-depth discussion on that.
Yeah, so just real quick, responsible disclosure is basically responsibly disclosing vulnerabilities as you find them. So it's taking the appropriate and standard, it's not standard, but I can't find the right word, but it's basically a generally accepted way to disclose vulnerabilities. And so you want to make sure that you're doing it responsibly so that you're not causing a bunch of WordPress sites to get hacked because you found the vulnerability and you just publicly disclosed it before responsibly disclosing it.
Yeah, it's kind of a way of making sure the ecosystem stays in balance because, if you find vulnerability and you don't disclose it or the disclosure doesn't get taken seriously, then it won't get fixed and it's going to stay there for attackers to take advantage of. But if you don't disclose it responsibly, but it still gets out there, if it gets leaked or if it gets publicly published before the developer has a chance to fix it, then you give attackers a first mover advantage where they can use it to take over a bunch of sites or, attack vulnerable targets before anything can be done about it. So it's really what the community has settled on as the best way of dealing with getting stuff fixed, while still eventually making it known that there was a vulnerability, making sure that, once it gets fixed, the public knows about it so they know to update to the newest version, because otherwise they might not have an incentive to do that.
Okay, good. Now, before we get into our first section, let's get ready for the swag opportunity that we have. Now, before we do that, we are going to post a link. And you can answer the question in there to win the Wordfence swag. But please keep in mind, we ask that you do not answer the question in the chat. If you want to put your answer in the chat, you can wait until the end of the show whenever we announce the winners before we announce the answer there. So we are going to be posting a form in just a moment, and you'll see the question there as well. The question will be, what is a proof of concept, and why is it important in responsible disclosure? So we will have a form in there, and you can go ahead and submit your answer there. And we will get back to you all at the end of the show here, and we'll send you an email if you submitted the correct answer. And I believe that will be the first 5 correct answers that we get. Okay, so on to our content today. Ram, Chloe, what do you think, starting with the basics, what is a vulnerability and what exactly would be or what should be reported?
So a vulnerability is basically a flaw in something, in code or process. It allows a threat actor to take advantage of that basically software component or process in an unexpected or undocumented way. We often refer to bugs as undocumented features, but sometimes those features let someone who's not allowed to, who you don't want to have permission to, alter the integrity, confidentiality, or availability of software component or process. that am I pretty close on, Chloe?
Yeah, so like in the case of WordPress, vulnerability might be a flaw in WordPress plugin code that doesn't have a capability check. So someone else with not the appropriate privileges is able to execute that code and complete an action, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I mean there's there's the OWASP top 10 vulnerabilities. There's the 10 most frequently found vulnerabilities. I think if we're going to list them in order, they're what? Injection, broken authentication, sensitive data exposure, XML external entities, broken access control. That's actually the one we see most with WordPress is broken access control, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And security misconfiguration, which is kind of, a catch-all for anything that's not broken access control or broken authentication or one of the others. Cross-site scripting, which is, I guess, the second most common thing we see that's really impactful. Mm-hmm. There's insecure deserialization, which allows PHP object injection, which we start to see fairly frequently as well. There's using components with known vulnerabilities, which is, well, that's sort of like a meta vulnerability because using a component with known vulnerabilities, but those known vulnerabilities are going to be one of those other vulnerabilities we already mentioned.
Yeah, so like using Tim Thumb in your plugin, a vulnerable version of Tim Thumb.
Yeah, but like what the Tim Thumb actually does is allow file upload, or was it file content grabbing? I forget.
I don't remember.
Now, Ram, you had mentioned that broken access control can be pretty common. Can you give us an idea of what exactly you would see with that?
Well, broken access control, that's, again, the thing we see most common in WordPress. And basically it means that a functionality that should be available to administrative users, such as, being able to insert JavaScript or being able to make a change to the site's configuration, suddenly becomes available to either users that have lower levels of privileges, like subscribers, or to visitors that have no privileges and aren't logged in at all. So that it basically just means that the wrong people are able to do things to your site. Someone who's not authorized to, make changes, can make changes.
And these are things that we see pretty commonly. You also mentioned cross-site scripting. Can you give a little overview on that for anybody who's not familiar? That's something, you can see that, quite a bit in live traffic at times, some blocks for cross-site scripting.
Yeah, so basically just about every browser that, normal people actually use runs JavaScript. And if an attacker can get that JavaScript to run in a visitor's browser, it can get that browser to do stuff that maybe the visitor didn't intend. And if the visitor is also the site owner, then that JavaScript can get the site owner's browser to do stuff like add a new administrator account, add a backdoor to the theme header, that kind of thing. So cross-site scripting is, I kind of want to say, routinely overlooked. It only gets a sort of medium vulnerability score, but you can do so much with it just because literally every browser that a human uses is going to run JavaScript unless that person is super paranoid and has turned it off.
Now, we are going to talk about how these vulnerabilities are found and using the source code for these to find them. And I know, Ram and Chloe, you use different methods to a degree, but somebody who's new that might just be getting into this, we listed 10 different things that are commonly found there. Is it going to be broken access control maybe more often than the others that you might run into?
I feel like that's kind of changing a little bit. I feel like more plugin developers are adhering to best practices with WordPress plugins. You'll still see broken access control being part of it, but you'll see a higher rate of things like cross-site scripting, SQL injection, insecure deserialization. The vulnerabilities will be a little bit trickier to exploit in a lot of cases.
I think we had a best practices stream maybe a month or so ago. Ram, do you recall, Chloe? I know we did one that talked about these, so that would be a good thing if you're just getting into this. Maybe you're a plugin author or you're just getting started as a plugin author. Definitely a good thing to go back and watch because we go over some best practices there. So we listed 10 there, different vulnerabilities that we run into, broken access control being a common one, and cross-site scripting. Anything else to add on those?
So one thing I don't see in those is remote code execution. And realistically, that's kind of because remote code execution is sort of the end state that can occur from a number of those. But it's really anything that does result in remote code execution, whether it's cross-site scripting, whether it's insecure deserialization, whether it's broken access control, whether it's just being able to upload a file, unrestricted file upload, that's sort of the end state where the attacker has owned your server, or at least your account on the server. That's where they own your site. So it's something to be aware of as a sort of end state for most of these.
And the list that we went over here, so if you're going through your plugins or you're noticing a common issue on your site, these would be along the lines of what would be considered a vulnerability that should be reported. And if you think that you found this, you would want to reach out to somebody, responsibly, maybe a security professional. You could reach out to Wordfence and report an issue if you believe that you're seeing something.
Yeah. I wanted to clarify something. Dave Harrington is right. Remote code execution is the code running on the server rather than in the browser. However, with something like cross-site scripting, you can get remote code execution on the server by running JavaScript in an administrator's browser, at which point that JavaScript can be used to add a shell to, say, a theme header. And at that point, you have remote code execution. It's not the only thing to be aware of, because there's still things like, leaking sensitive information. But it is the thing that we've seen most attackers really try for, because it's the thing that's more or less most monetizable, because you can use it to, put spam on a site, make the site participate in a botnet, that kind of thing.
That makes sense. Now, should we move on to how people are finding these vulnerabilities in code? And I know I started off, if you're interested in looking through and finding these sorts of things, or maybe you're just you're running a handful of sites and you're noticing a commonality with a compromise, perhaps, how would somebody go in and look for a vulnerability like this?
So sorry, I'll let Chloe go.
So there's like three core ways, basically. So for the most part, a lot of these ethical or unethical hackers are going to be taking a pen testing kind of approach, because they may or may not have access to certain things. But so there's three core methods. You're going to have black box, white box, and gray box. So black box is no access to any source code. So that would be someone maybe with written permission. Make sure you have permission if you're like going and testing a site, but testing everything without having any access to the source code. So like observing requests and responses and figuring out how the application works without knowing any of the source code. White box is going to be having full access to the source code. So that's going to be like WordPress plugins and themes and stuff, because we do have access to the full source code. But then there's also gray box, which is a mixture of the two, gray or black and white boxes. So that's going to be access to the source codes, but also taking a look from a not using the source code. So just kind of combining the two. That's my preferred method. I kind of do a little bit of both, of reading the source code and also just poking at the plugin or theme and the functionality and how it works. So with WordPress, you'll likely see gray box or white box. So they're going to be looking at the source code, finding those flaws, those common coding flaws, looking for ways that they can exploit plugins and themes and WordPress core itself as well. Yeah, Rand, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, you covered it more or less exactly like I would say. I think that you'll mostly see gray box testing come into play where some components are like open source, where it's just like, if someone's scanning the site, they can see that they have Apache version 2.0.1, and you can look up the source for that version, but there might be some, proprietary components running on the system as well. But one thing that, a question that might get raised by this, simply because, gray box and white box testing are, generally considered easier, is whether or not that means open source is less secure. And I really feel like the answer to that's no, because vulnerabilities get spotted and fixed faster.
Exactly.
And going with the theme today, you always want those, and you hope that they're disclosed properly, as we're speaking of today, to make. And when you have open source like that, and they're disclosed properly, it makes things much safer. Now, when we talk about the black box testing or gray box, is it common for some people that are looking through things and looking for these vulnerabilities to not use the source code as a preference initially?
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely something that people would do. That's actually how I like to start things, is not looking at the source code unless I found something specifically in the source code. But I like to get a feel for how the application works, the user functionality and that sort of stuff, and taking it from like a black box approach at the beginning, and then using the source code after that.
Yeah. And I mean, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, once you get to that point where you figure out the functionality using maybe the front end, do you find that it sort of falls together a little more easily once you start bringing in the source code at that point?
For me,
You're,
yeah.
you're sort of seeing how everything's working on the back end there.
Yeah.
I generally tend to take the opposite approach. I look at the code for something that looks weird, and then I try to match that up with where it works in the user interface. And in some cases, you'll just find, dangling code that doesn't actually match up to anything that users can use. It's just still there and still vulnerable to, certain inputs. It's just that there's nothing to send those inputs in the user interface. So I feel like there's advantages to both methods. And I mean, again, it's one of the things that you definitely want to make sure of is that if you're testing for this kind of thing, you're taking an ethical approach. Either that means written permission of whoever you're testing, or I mean, if you set up your own test site or your own test virtual machine, then you can hack yourself as much as you want. And I feel like that's probably the safest place to start as far as being ethical about it.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, so depending on which method you use, we see that RAM uses one way to go about it, and Chloe uses a different way. So once you find an issue, whether you're looking at the source code or you're messing around with the functionality on the front end, you find a vulnerability, and then what's next in this process?
We call that a proof of concept. What you want to do is find a way to make the exploit repeatable. It's a lot like, with, scientific research where you want to make sure that other people can duplicate your findings. A proof of concept is basically a way of doing that. It's a set of steps or a program. We like programmatic proof of concepts because they make it pretty easy to replicate something. But it's a way to tell another person how to duplicate the vulnerability you found. And in most cases, the person you're going to be giving this to is the person who's in charge of fixing the vulnerability.
Yeah, and you should also, now that you found the vulnerability, you should make sure that you document everything you can about it. If you can read code and you figured out where in the code it is, maybe you want to take notes of that specific part of the code just for your reference, and perhaps you can feed that on to the developer so they know exactly where they should be looking. You want to just try and gather as much information as you can, like what is the result of the vulnerability in question, all those sorts of details, maybe request response captures. Perhaps you want to have a little doc and then keep a link to the plugin or theme or whatever, or software. And so just make as much documentation as you can before you move on to the next step of the process.
I do want to address a conversation that's going on in the comments. There is a tool called WPScan that you can run against a WordPress site, and it will tell you, to its best guess, what plugins that site is running and what versions of those plugins the site is running. Now, it does require on a variety of different fingerprints, so it's not 100% foolproof, and it might not detect every single plugin, but for the most part, it's reasonably good at what it does. So it is possible to get a general idea of the plugin loadout of a given site.
So Chloe had mentioned you're starting a new doc at this point, and you're just gathering as much information as you can once you find a vulnerability. Is that pretty much the beginning for both of you, where you're starting, like whether you get a tip from somebody who's saying, okay, that there might be an issue in this plugin, or whether you come across it yourself? I'm guessing the first step there is just compiling all of the information, and then what's the next step here in the process?
Well, I think the next step is to find out a good way to get in touch with the author of the code or the person responsible for fixing the code once you have all the information together.
Now, do we have, I was going to say, do we have some examples of a proof of concept potentially? I believe we defined proof of concept. That was you, right, Ram?
I feel like... I don't know. I feel like we could probably make it a little more concise. But yes, proof of concept is basically a repeatable method of exploiting a vulnerability.
And that's what we were getting at with as far as finding the way to repeat this issue and taking down all of the information that is known. Does that pretty much encompass the proof of concept at that point?
I mean, I feel like there's other information you can include that's, not necessary in the proof of concept. If you, if you can like document the particular lines of code that are causing the vulnerability, those don't necessarily get included in the proof of concept, but you do want to send them to the person responsible for fixing the vulnerability if possible, because it lets them know where to start looking and why it happens. I do know that a lot of security researchers, especially on closed source projects, don't have the, luxury or ability to say, hey, it's this line of code. But if you are doing white box testing and you know which line of code is vulnerable, definitely document that. Or lines or functions or, yeah.
And circling back to our swag question, we just defined what the proof of concept is. Can you give a little overview of why this is such an important thing in responsible disclosure?
Yeah, so essentially a proof of concept acts as a proof that the vulnerability exists and that it can be exploited. So it's very important to prove that that vulnerability exists. And it's also important so that developers can replicate their findings or your findings, and then they can test the patch and those sorts of things.
There was a recent vulnerability that had a recent proof of concept that neither of us were able to duplicate.
Yeah.
But I won't go into that too much. That was not one we found.
Now, do we have anything to show at this point? Chloe, I know you want to show a few things, but as far as proof of concept goes, do we want to show anything there, or are we going to hold off for a moment?
Yeah, I can go ahead and share my screen real quick to just show a proof of concept real quick to give you an idea of what that looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and click share my screen. And so here I just have a Google Doc. And so there's two different ways you can do a POC. You can do a script, or you can do a walkthrough if you don't generally necessarily know how to write a full script. So with a walkthrough, you might just say, log in as a subscriber and then send the following request, which is just a one-line request that will do whatever the exploit is to do. And this is from WP Database Reset. It's about a year old now. So hopefully everybody's been up to date on that and has patched since a year ago. And then the other proof of concept way is to write a script. So that would be a full script that will automate the exploit for you. So for example, this is the arguments that you'll supply when you run the script. This first little chunk would log in as the subscriber if that's required and set some cookies in a cookie jar. And then this would be the chunk that actually does the exploiting. So, for example, this required a couple parameters set. And so that's generally an idea of how proof of concepts work. So that first one is you could just walk through it. And then the second one is you could create a fully automated script.
And I mean, you can use any language you like that's able to send requests. We tend to use PHP just because we've gotten fairly quick at writing them up in PHP, but Python, Node, Bash, curl will work just fine, depending.
I think Python's one of the most common ones for exploit script.
Yeah, I see a lot of Python proof of concepts in exploit DB.
Yeah.
So we talked about you're ready now. You found an issue. You have a proof of concept ready to go. Ram, you had mentioned the first thing that you're doing is establishing communication and a secure channel to disclose these details. Where are you going from there? And what steps do you take for that? Because it's definitely very important to make sure that you have a secure channel there to relay the information.
Well, generally, what you'd want to do is you have to find out who's actually responsible for remediating a vulnerability in a software component. In most cases, that'll be the software's developer or publisher. If you are super lucky, you can find out right away who's actually responsible because they'll have a security page or security contact. I'm going to share my screen. Some folks that we've worked with in the past that have been extremely responsive and have a really good way of handling this are Ninja Forums. They have a responsible security disclosure policy, which basically is hey, you found something in our plugin, here's how you report it to us, and here's how we'll handle it. And that's just a really great way to do things. So we commend them. And we've had, several other plugin developers we worked with who have, had either a security policy or had really clear contact information. But generally what you do when you in doubt, when there's no security policy, is you find a support channel for that plugin's developer and you tell them, hey, we feel we may have found a security vulnerability in one of your products. Is this a good channel to disclose that? And typically it'll get sent up the chain to someone who can actually deal with it.
At that point, what sort of time frame do you two typically see once you start interacting or you ask for a channel to send that? Do you see that it's typically within hours, within a day, 3 days?
It depends on the plugin developer. Right, Chloe?
Yeah, it's incredibly variable.
We had a vulnerability pop up over last week, actually. Found out about it first thing in the morning. Well, most of us were on break, but found out a vulnerability, realized it was a thing, got in touch with the developer, and they got back to us within 2 hours and patched it an hour later, over the holidays. And that was just amazing. But then there'll be certain large page builder plugins we shall not name, who will take weeks.
Now, I'm not sure if you had mentioned what happens if you get to a couple weeks and you're not hearing anything, you don't have a contact method for one of these authors. Is there somebody we reach out to? What's the process there?
The WordPress plugins team, if it's a plugin in the WordPress repository, then we'd recommend, if you haven't heard from the plugin developer, if you don't get an initial response within 14 days, then we'd recommend contacting the WordPress plugins team. If it's a premium plugin, almost all of those go through Envato Marketplace or Code Canyon these days. They're the ones you should contact if you don't get a response from the premium plugin author. And if it's a premium plugin, you can typically contact the plugin author through their contact form on that site. There are a few edge cases where there are premium plugins that aren't for sale on one of the main marketplaces, and at that point, your mileage may vary. If you can't get in touch with them, if it's been over 30 days with no communication from them and there's just nothing you can do at that point, you may want to consider going public. But at that point, you've given them a reasonable chance at remediating the issue, getting things fixed. And I mean, even then, if they're just kind of slow getting back to you, it's better to, just work with them slowly if you can.
Now, at this point, we have a firewall rule in effect, right, before we would consider going public in most cases. Have we had to do that previously?
I mean, we typically try and get the firewall rule out the same day we contact the plugin author or developer. We try to, make sure that our users are covered, and we release that firewall rule in a way that's, obfuscated so that it can't be traced back to the specific vulnerability if possible. And then we try and contact the plugin author and see if we can get it fixed.
Now, in our initial contact, whenever we send the proof of concept over or we're developing that channel, do we give a deadline in one of our initial responses? And if should you give a deadline?
I think it's important to give some kind of deadline in at all contacts. If it's just an inquiry, if you're just really not sure about who it is, then maybe not. But in most cases, you're not going to be. In most cases, you're reasonably confident that this is the channel to try. In that which case, you can send a, hey, we're going to disclose this if we don't hear from you in like 14 to 30 days, whatever you pick. And to answer Dave Harrington's question, WordPress will pull buggy plugins from the repository. You'll see occasionally a plugin has been removed from the repository. Sometimes that's because they've violated some or other standards, but a lot of the time it's because they've had a security vulnerability, and the plugins team wasn't able to get in touch with them in a reasonable amount of time, or they weren't responsive at all. So, yeah.
Do you know if it lists that as, I believe I looked at one the other day and it said that a plugin had been removed at the developer's request. Do you know if it mentions if there's a security vulnerability there?
I don't believe it does. A lot of the time, if the closure is permanent, that means either they couldn't get in touch with the developer or the developers basically decided they no longer want to make any changes or be responsible for fixing up the plugin. If a plugin is closed permanently, uninstall it, please, because even if it's not known to be vulnerable right now, if a vulnerability is ever found, no one's ever going to fix it.
Yeah, in a couple instances that you might be seeing this on your sites, whether you're running just one site with Wordfence or a bunch of sites, if you see scan results mentioning abandoned plugins or plugins that have been removed from the WordPress.org repository, those are both good signs to get into the site and start taking a look around for a replacement, something that has similar functionality, and ideally you're going to want something that's updated regularly. Even if the plugin author has had issues with vulnerabilities in the past, Ram, Chloe, do you think it says a lot about the author if that's fixed really quick? I mean, you're going to have little bugs in code, unfortunately, a good bit of the time, but it comes down to how quick can these authors fix the issue.
Yes, that, and whether or not they're honest in their changelogs about whether it was a security issue. We generally tend to trust developers who, once they push a fix for it, they're like, hey, fix for security issue, rather than random update.
Yeah, I'd rather install a plugin that had like 5 vulnerabilities that were patched the same day than one plugin that had one vulnerability that took 2 months to patch.
Yeah. We did get a question, what about reporting to a vulnerability to Wordfence if no response after 30 days? And I mean, we can try, but if you're just not hearing from someone, all that would really do is, hope that they'll listen to us where they wouldn't listen to you. And I feel like there might be a few edge cases where that's the case, but I feel like most plugin developers are responsible enough that if the report is formatted correctly and contains enough information, that they will take it seriously and get back to you.
Now, looking at that, at our leaderboard for the issues that you two have found, there's been quite a few. Do you find, Chloe, that a lot of the times when you're reaching out to these plugin authors and the developers, that they're pretty understanding and they're easy to work with? Is it more often than not?
Yeah. I don't think I've ever really had a case where it's been a bad encounter or anything. So for the most part, everybody's really easygoing and really willing to work to get a patch out there.
Is that the same that you've experienced, Ram?
For the most part, yes. Pretty much the only negative experiences I've had have just been, delays in hearing back from people.
Yeah.
So one thing I do think we should cover is what to do once a vulnerability has been patched. And I think this is a step that gets missed a lot, but and it's not necessarily even mandatory. But I do feel like it's not a bad idea for the original researcher to take a look at the patch and double check it to make sure that there's no workarounds, to make sure that the patch actually adequately addresses the original vulnerability. Because we've seen a lot of cases where a vulnerability gets patched, and I mean, like, a bunch of the vulnerabilities I've found have been, plugin gets patched. We look in the code and see what it was, so we can write a firewall rule, and we discover another vulnerability in the same place. So,
I was going to bring that up. I was going to ask you do you think that's a good place for somebody to start if they're just getting interested in this, kind of looking around at plugins that have been recently patched? I mean, it seems like, I know you've mentioned in the past, that's a common place for you to look, to kind of go in and dig around and see if there's anything either relative to that or just something completely different in there.
I do feel like that's not a bad idea if, you're working with a plugin developer that's actually admitting that there was a security issue in their changelog. You can look at the diff between the old version and the new version to get an idea of what changed. And if you're interested in doing white box testing, then that'll actually kind of give you a sense for what to look for, what vulnerable code looks like, ways it can be patched. That's really hard to get any other way.
Yeah, and to add on to that, WPScan is a vulnerability database. So you can go through, you can look at all the different plugins that have had vulnerabilities in the past, and you can go ahead and install those, roll back to the vulnerable version, and then more often than not, there's also a POC in there, proof of concept, so that you can test and learn using these tools and reviewing the old code and everything. So I think it's a really great way to learn.
Yes, you can also look at exploit.db if you're interested in proof of concepts, but I will give you the warning that, like, a large percentage of them don't actually work as stated.
Yes.
Except with extremely contrived environments, so don't take for granted that they'll actually work. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, I know we mentioned we like seeing that a security fix has been included in a new plugin in a patch. Now, we see that in a changelog potentially. Is there anywhere else that we would look for something once a theme developer fixes a vulnerability? And where exactly are we finding these changelogs for anybody who's new to this?
Well, one of the places you can look is the plugin repository itself.
Here, I can go ahead and share my screen. I have a couple examples pulled up.
Cool, thank you.
So here is one from a while back. This is the same one that I showed you the proof of concept for. It hasn't had much changes since then, so it's easy to find the changelog, the entry for the security fix. So if we go down to 315, we can see that they included security fixes right here in their changelog. And so what you can do is you can go over to the development log, which shows you what exactly changed. So if we go here, click on development log, and we go to, where is it? It's so long ago. 12 months ago, we can view the diff. And if we go down, we can view all these different changes, but I'm going to go ahead and scroll immediately to the one that was the security fix down here. And so right here, we can see the old code, and then we can see the new code. So this old code is what was vulnerable, and then this new one is what was fixed. So this was missing a nonce check, and it was also missing a capability check, so unauthenticated users could actually reset an entire database, and logged in users could actually reset the database and be elevated to privileges of that of an administrator. So it was actually pretty bad. But here you can see the changes, and so yeah, the development log and the changelog are very important.
We did get some questions about, for developers, do you have any tools that you recommend to automate looking for vulnerable code patterns? And the truth is there are a bunch of static code analysis tools out there. There's PHP Code Sniffer. There's a WordPress extension for that. There's WP Bullet. But pretty much any static code analysis tool is going to give you just a huge amount of false positives to comb through, and also not spot everything that you actually want to see. So they have their uses, but they are tools, not solutions. They'll give you a sort of blunt overview of where you might want to look for something interesting. And they'll give you places to start looking, but they won't necessarily give you places to finish looking. And Lawrence J. had another question. And Chloe, I think this one's interesting for you.
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah. So a lot of the times I'll use WP directory to look for vulnerable components. So we know that Ajax actions tend to miss capability checks. So a while back, that was one of the things Ram and I looked a lot for was just Ajax actions, and then we would go from there. We don't go A through Z, but we do pick them out if we see vulnerable components from a search or someone brought it up to us, or for Ram oftentimes finds vulnerabilities while he's looking at other vulnerabilities that have been patched. So that's another way we target plugins and stuff. We'll also take a look at some of the higher user count ones, just because those have a higher user base. So if a vulnerability is found in that and we get that patch, that means that we can protect more users, which is good for the community. Is there any other ways that we target them, Ram, that I'm not thinking of?
I mean, occasionally we'll get tips from people. Sometimes our site cleaning team will find a site where they can't explain how it got hacked, but it did have this one plugin and it looks kind of suspicious. So, we'll look into it and maybe it does have a vulnerability. There's a bunch of ways to find vulnerabilities. We do tend to triage them by install count and user base, just because we want to make sure we cover the most impactful ones first. But if we know that our customers are being impacted or people are being impacted, if it's an actual 0 day and it's being actively attacked, that changes the rules. And I feel like that's something we should get into before we run out of time, how a 0 day kind of changes the disclosure rules. So a 0 day is basically a vulnerability that attackers already know about, and attackers know about at the same time as or before the actual plugin author or security researchers know about it. That means that it's already being attacked, the cat's out of the bag, and at that point, what you want to do is damage control. For us, this means releasing a firewall rule, but in some cases, we'll also disclose immediately to let people know that they should deactivate or remove the vulnerable plugin, even if a fix isn't out, because it's already being attacked. Chloe, you had a story about Tyler's site got hacked, right?
Yeah. So one question is, how do you know you're dealing with a 0 day vulnerability? So you've been hacked, but all your plugins are up to date. You know you have strong passwords. You know you're following all the security standard best practices. You might have a 0 day vulnerability on your hand, and that was the case with my fiance Tyler. His site had gotten hacked. All of his plugins were up to date and everything, and apparently there was a vulnerability that wasn't patched yet, but got discovered by someone. But I think someone was in the process of disclosing it at the same time. It was a weird situation, but it was a 0 day vulnerability that was being actively exploited. And once I got around to taking a look at it, I found the vulnerability and everything. We got a waffle together. So yeah, it's something to be mindful of if you get hacked. Are you following all those standards? And if you are, then maybe you should dig a little bit deeper and see if maybe one of those plugins has a vulnerability there.
Yeah. Gunstock Reviews has another question. For instance, you had just an example where a nonce was missing, and I think you just said is set check. Any tools that would flag those issues? I'm not actually aware of any tools that would flag that type of issue. Those are actually fairly prevalent. The ones where it does check the nonce, but only if it's present. We're actually getting some mileage out of those kinds of vulnerabilities. And realistically, you're going to be better off just, coming up with a couple regular expressions that'll look for common variants of that type of problem than you are going to by using any particular static analysis tool. Because when it comes down to it, almost all static analysis tools, at least for, PHP code, are just a bunch of regular expressions. Like there's a few that go a bit more in depth, but that's at the basis of a lot of how they operate. So come up with your own regular expressions if you're worried about a particular problem. We have a few collections that we use on occasion to search for problems. So
now we have just a few minutes left, and we think we may have just lost Ram as well. Anything that you want to cover, Chloe? One thing we didn't cover, bug bounty programs. Real quick, though, what are a few ways not to disclose an issue that you find? And I know we can fire off a couple of these pretty quick. We talked about the right way to do it, find a good channel with a developer. What should you not do here?
Don't post it immediately on your website or on social media.
Yeah.
before you've given the plugin authors or developers, whoever's responsible for fixing it, a chance to fix it.
Don't tell your friends because you don't know what they're going to do with it.
You don't know who they're going to tell.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Don't
you
do
always want.
Yeah, don't do anything that publicly discloses the details.
Don't extort the company that is vulnerable.
Yeah, and that's another thing, we had on the list, I found a vulnerability on your website and these, some scammy sorts of emails.
Yeah, that is something we occasionally, we'll get it too, but, there are, security researchers out there, and I use the term with air quotes, that all they do is, they'll use public tools like securityheaders.com or, like automated scanners, and they'll just scan a bunch of websites, and they'll ask for, you to pay them a couple $100 because they found that you haven't deleted XML RPC, so someone could theoretically use that to get into your site if they knew your username and password. You don't get a grade of A on your security headers because you don't have a content security policy. And yes, those are useful, but we still haven't quite worked out how to make those work with WordPress very well without issues on a lot of sites. So, that's going to be a thing that all WordPress sites are pretty much going to fail that check, even though it's on its own not the end of the world. So if you get messages like that, you again want to look for people using the methods we said. If someone is making sure that it's a secure communications channel, that's a point in their favor. If they're asking for money right away, that might be a little more sketchy. It's okay for people to inquire if you have a bug bounty program, but if they ask for a specific dollar amount, that's kind of a red flag. If they tell you about a vulnerability and it doesn't have a lot of details, or it doesn't have a lot of impact, or it's just, hey, you're running a vulnerable version, check to see if you are running a vulnerable version. If you're not, then, or if you're running a patched version with the version string just altered, like the whole jQuery thing for WordPress that they just fixed in 5.6, then maybe don't necessarily get back to them. But that's not to say that it's not good to make sure that everything is up to date, just that if people are, sort of cold emailing you to tell you that your configuration is suboptimal and calling it vulnerable, then they might not have your best interests in mind. But if they provide more detail, then you definitely want to listen.
Looks like we have another question, Ram, about a 0-day, if you want to take that. So if you find a 0-day vulnerability for a popular plugin, you put a lot of time, effort into discovering, the company does not have a bug bounty policy, what would you do for compensation there?
That's tough. And realistically, a big part of it is if you're in this specific for compensation, I recommend researching issues that are in scope for companies that have a publicly stated bug bounty program, because that way you're going to make some money off of it. If you find a 0-day for a popular plugin, I feel like it's our responsibility to disclose stuff no matter what. You might not get compensated monetarily, but you'll be the person who discovered a 0-day in a popular plugin, and that gives you some reputation. And reputation is actually worth something, especially if you have a reputation for dealing fairly with people. So it's a tricky question. You might not get money from that particular find, but people will be more willing to trust you, more willing to hire you, and you'll still develop skills that you can use for companies that do have a bug bounty program. On the flip side of that, bug bounty programs are awesome. They are not a substitute for hiring pen testers or having an in-house QA department. And that's another thing. If you find a 0-day and you can be the person who found that 0-day, that looks great on your pen tester resume. So companies don't rely just on bug bounty programs, though they are good. Bug bounty hunters, if you want to be sure you're going to get paid, make sure that you're attacking targets that are in scope for companies that offer a bounty. But that doesn't mean it's not worthwhile searching other places. It just means you might not get paid for that thing.
Yeah, that's a good question. And before we get on to a little bit of a recap here and the swag winners, so we talked a little bit about some people that might just be getting interested in this. So if you're interested in WordPress security research, what would we give as far as advice on getting into this more?
I mean, Chloe actually has some really good advice for this. We more or less use the same tools, only with different IDEs. So,
Yeah, so learn how to debug with Xdebug using VS Code or PHP Storm. I actually learned how to use VS Code in my most recent certification, so now I know how to use both. So, yay! So learn how to debug, read code, and everything using those tools are really great. So you can set breakpoints, and then you can run the program, and you can see exactly how the code flows. This is one of the huge things that helped me learn more about PHP because I really didn't know much about PHP before I got started doing vulnerability research, which sounds crazy. But that was basically the tool for me that helped me learn what I needed to learn in order to do that. And then you also need to get really familiar with Burp Suite. You can use the community version, which is free. This is like a prize tool for web application security researchers. It's literally like almost everything you need right there. And the company that makes it actually has an academy called Portswigger Academy, which provides you with several different resources and like challenges so that you can learn more about the common vulnerabilities out there and how you can exploit them and how to use Burp and use that to your advantage when you're looking for these vulnerabilities. Get familiar with the disclosure process we outlined today so that you can disclose your vulnerabilities after you find them and do so responsibly. And then another great learning tool is WPScan, as I previously mentioned. It's a vulnerability database, so they have almost all the previously patched vulnerabilities in WordPress, plugins, themes, and core, all in one place so that you can see the proof of concepts, you can see what plugin, what was the vulnerability, and then you can match that to the development log, see exactly what the code was. You can use WP rollback plugin to roll back to a vulnerable version, or there's other ways you can do it as well. So that's a really great learning tool for you as well. And then my final note is you can do it. It doesn't matter what your experience is. If you want to do it and you're scared of doing it because it seems too difficult, it's not. I promise you, you can do it. So do it. If you want to.
Practice CTFs. John Papajohn has mentioned practice CTFs, and that is definitely something that's useful. There's not a lot of WordPress specific ones, but a lot of the ones that you learn from just web app penetration testing, CTFs. There's a bunch of like vulnerable web app, virtual machines. That's actually another thing that I recommend getting some practice in. Get used to setting up and tearing down virtual machines so that you can, set up a vulnerable box that, you can test on, because that'll make it a lot easier and a lot faster to like set up certain configurations. If you think that you might have a vulnerability, you can just install what you think is a vulnerable configuration and test against that without, endangering yourself ethically or legally.
Yeah, there's also the Damn Vulnerable web app that it has all the most common web app vulnerabilities and some more complex ones, so you can start really basic and then kind of grow. That's another great resource for you to set up your own test environment and get familiar with web app vulnerabilities.
Yeah, Jeff Zafiris asks, how much of a WP guru must you be before jumping into security vulnerabilities? And my opinion is that if you can, if you've, modified the code on a theme or a plugin, if you're comfortable editing a WP config file remotely, if these are not things that scare you, then, or even if they are a little bit, but they're things that you feel like you might not be scared of if you do them enough, then you can jump in. It's anyone can learn to do this. It'll take longer for some people than others, and don't beat yourself up if it takes a while. But once the concepts click, then it starts making sense.
That's good advice. Now, I believe we have a graphic here sort of outlining the 10 vulnerabilities, and I know Chloe had just mentioned some common vulnerabilities that we see. So these are the 10 that we had went over, and we'd mentioned, number 5 there, something we see commonly, as well as cross-site scripting. So we also have the swag winners at the moment. The swag question was, what is a proof of concept and why is it important in responsible disclosure? Ram or Chloe, can you give us just a quick little answer what we might expect to see there as far as a good acceptable answer?
Well, the definition I gave was basically a repeatable way to exploit a vulnerability, a way that a set of steps or a program that another person can use to duplicate an exploit.
Okay, yeah, and that gives the authors just the ability to replicate that and test from there, and then go on to hopefully get a fix out for that as quickly as possible. So those were our swag winners that we had on the screen. We have your email, so we will get a message out to you. We have 7 winners there. So check your email. We'll have something coming over to you, and we'll get some details to send the swag to you. So congratulations to you all. So a question in the chat. Let us know if you're using Wordfence Central at the moment. If you are, how many sites do you have? Are you an agency? Do you have a bunch of sites on there? And while you do that, Ram, can you give us just a little overview? If you're not using Wordfence Central, why should you be using Wordfence Central?
Well, if you're not using Wordfence Central, Wordfence Central lets you manage multiple sites at once. It allows you to use templates to change the configuration of multiple sites at once, or at least the Wordfence configuration of multiple sites at once. It records any security events that might have happened, so you have a log of stuff that has happened that's security related for every site that's connected. And we also have something called Wordfence Central Teams, where if you're an agency or a small business or a small company and you'd like to, help let someone else manage your sites or hire someone else to manage your sites, but not give them permanent access, you can do that. Or even just, someone who's part of your team can log in, manage site configurations, but without necessarily seeing your, billing information. You can do that. So
definitely some handy features there. And if you have a bunch of sites and you're using Wordfence on them and you're not using Central at the moment, it's really easy to set up and get your sites on there. We go live here on Wordfence Live each Tuesday at noon Eastern Time, 9 a.m. Pacific. So you can hit the like button below. Let us know you're enjoying this content. If you have not already, hit the subscribe button. If you hit the bell, you'll be notified when we go live, which is each Tuesday. Sometimes here and there, we're putting new videos out, sort of walking you through some of our new features, like Wordfence Central Teams, which is pretty new still. And there's a lot of functionality there. It's very easy to set up. Earlier, I mentioned the mailing list, and it goes right along with what we're talking about today. When we find these issues, and you saw the leaderboard with Chloe and Ram, there are a lot of issues that we find, and we get the information out onto the mailing list when we can to give you a chance to get the plugins updated, maybe switch plugins if you have to in the meantime. Also, again, as I said at the beginning of the show, we want to thank our premium subscribers, our premium customers, and all of you who have been viewing Wordfence Live. If you're not a premium customer right now, you're missing out on the real-time IP block list, which does a lot of the things that that you want done on your site for you without having to configure anything. You'll notice at times a lot of blocks. Sometimes you'll get the high block alert email, which is letting you know maybe a couple hundred blocks have been made in a short period of time. Otherwise, if you weren't using premium, those would have hit the site and the firewall would have had to have dealt with that in a different way. So if you're not using premium, go ahead and check that out. You get one license for $99. If you have a staging site or a development site, that is also covered. If you buy multiple licenses for multiple sites, you're going to be getting discounts there along the way, and you can get those set up on Wordfence Central, like Ram said. So lots of things to look at. Go back onto the YouTube channel here and check out some of the content that you might have missed. We got a lot of cool things. We walked through a lot of different features, and we really appreciate you taking the time to check it out. Chloe, Ram, before we ring the bell and get out of here, anything to end with?
Just thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe and watch Chloe hack, me and Scott in some of our earlier episodes, because that does happen, and that has happened. So,
all too frequently. Yeah. Okay, guys, we appreciate it. Thanks for tuning in. We hope that we see a bunch of you in 2021, and we appreciate you stopping by today. We will be on next week with some new great content. Be sure to check out our next podcast, which I believe is going to be episode 100, and we're going to have some special stuff on that. You will hear Ram on there with our Director of Marketing, Kathy Zant, and if you haven't checked it out already, it is awesome. To say the least. So we really appreciate it. Go ahead, Ram. I know you got some
I was just
inside
going to say,
information on the podcast.
if you go earlier in the podcast, you get to listen to Scott too. So
That's true. If you do a deep dive, you might get a little bit of me on there. So definitely subscribe to the mailing list. Also get on the podcast list because you're going to want to hear episode 100, and it's coming out soon. So keep your ear out for that. All right. We will be back next Tuesday. And we hope to see you then. Until next time, thanks from all of us here at Wordfence. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.